I've had the luxury of having to watch that bumper like 5 times, and I think I cry every time I see it. So just so you know, if you're emotionally compromised today, that was not the initial intent, but gosh, what a powerful thought to think about presence, about what presence means, right? Because look, here's the thing. We're in a digital age, and I promise you this is not a sermon series that gets to get down on technology. This ain't that, I promise. But connection has been redefined for us as a society, as a culture, as people. What it means to connect, what it means to be in a relationship, what it means to be present is different, right? And that started a long time ago, but really post-pandemic, it's just been ramped up to 11. And we find ourselves in a place questioning, well, what does it mean to be present? And why is being present so important in the first place? Like, okay, can I be present by connecting on social media? Can I be present by connecting through Zoom? What does present really look like? Now, you couple that with the reality that as people, every human being, whether you're a Jesus follower or not, this isn't just a Christian thing, this is a thing. Every human being asks 3 basic questions. And your brain is doing this whether you're thinking about it or not. But every human being has these 3 basic questions we wrestle with. The first one is, who am I? It's all the identity questions. Who exactly am I? Right? Who built me? How am I built? What am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? We're wrestling with that question. Number 2, who is God? And again, whether you're a Christian or not, there's many world religions, but even if you're not necessarily someone who believes in religion at this point or believes in God, you're asking yourself the question, where did I come from and who actually is in charge? Am I in charge or is somebody else in charge? Where does the authority rest? But then the third question is, what exactly is it? What's the best way for me to live? What's the best way for me to live? And whether you've said these exact words out loud or not, these are 3 questions that all of us wrestle with, because this is really the foundation of what life looks like now. You throw into the fact that these are the things we're wrestling with, and we find ourselves more disconnected than ever. Finding answers to these questions becomes difficult, right? Finding answers to these questions become difficult. One step further, if I might say, our children, for those of you that are parents, whether they're babies or teens or college students or out of the house and you're an empty nester, your children are asking these questions too, in the world that we live in today. And so the question really becomes like, what is it? How does presence play into the way that we answer these questions? And what I'm going to argue over the next couple of weeks is it has a lot to do with the answer to these 3 questions. And the struggles we find ourselves in, where we find ourselves kind of stressful about hope or stressful about the moment, or really like, almost finding ourselves in a place where we feel, have you ever heard this word before, escapism? Where we're like, stuff is just so brutal, I just don't want to think about it. Enter the world of TikTok. I'm not picking, but one of the things that's very popular in our home, I don't have TikTok, but one of the things that's popular in our home is watching these videos of people who do dumber things than we do, it seems like, so you watch their life and like, well, and at least I'm not that bad. Or you kind of escape into someone else's beautiful home, or escape into someone else's beautiful life, escape into someone else's beautiful family, and you see how their lives work, and you're like, well, our lives could look like that one day, but look how perfect that looks. And so we find ourselves, rather than kind of dealing with our situation and answering these questions for ourselves, we find ourselves drawing ourselves to someone else's answer of those questions. Now, we've got a lot of reasons to feel this way, and I am not naive. We've got a lot of reasons to find ourselves wanting to step out of our current situations. If you go way back to the summer, I introduced an idea in June. This was 5 months ago, so if you don't remember, it's okay. But I introduced an idea 5 months ago about how all of us constantly are processing messages from the reality that we live in, from people that are around us, from social media, from our bosses, our brains are constantly processing information. About 10,000 messages a day are processed by your brain. And what your brain is doing, whether you're paying attention to it or not, is creating what we call mental maps. We create these mental maps where we use it to interpret where we live and to interpret reality. This is why I think this is such a big problem, if I might say, because many of us find ourselves in a place where our reality is so broken and so messy that we don't want to talk about it or think about it, and so we start answering, who am I, who is God, and what's the best way to live based on a reality we don't live in. Based on someone else's reality, based on someone else's happy, based on someone else's way of looking at life. And this is why, again, several months ago, I introduced you to this idea that Jesus came as a rabbi. And it's a beautiful thing that he came as a rabbi, because a rabbi is just an informational guide for developing mental maps to reality. Jesus came to show you what reality really looks like. Jesus came to show you what reality really looks like. And hopefully that sounds vaguely familiar to some of you all who were here during that Overflow series back in June. But if not, that's okay. It's not the point to have to recall that. I'm going to talk about something else today. I just want this in the fore of your mind. So I want you to think for a second. If everyone that you meet, your kids, you, your boss, your friends, your enemies, everybody is asking the question, who am I? Who is God? And what's the best way to live? What role do you play in answering those questions? What role does the here and now play in answering those questions? What role does Jesus play in answering those questions? And the struggle for me as a dad, as a pastor, as someone who is a book nerd and reads a whole lot and tries to figure out and tinker with the world and figure out how to make it a better place for everybody that I love and care about, what I see is that there's not enough of us asking that question. We're perfectly fine to wrestle with, what does happy look like, but when we start asking ourselves the real questions, like, how is my presence affecting the people that are around me and the way that they look at the world? How is me being here a significant motivator for people that are around me? How is me dealing with the stuff that is in my life actually affecting the people that are looking in on me? And what am I missing? What am I missing when I decide not to look at the world the way that Jesus seems to want us to look at? So to get us started and to put you in the headspace to really maybe wrestle with this for a second, I want to tell you a story. But when I tell you this story, here's what I want you to do. I want you to put yourselves in the shoes of the dad who comes to talk to Jesus. And I want you to put yourself in Jesus' shoes, and I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the crowd. I want you to imagine for yourself that you are the person who comes and asks Jesus for help. Okay? Can you do that for me? So we're all gonna be actors and actresses for just a second. Put yourself in the mode of thinking that you are in this story as that character. Are you ready? So a little bit of context. The story I'm about to tell you that I'm going to read for you, it comes from the Gospel of Luke. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, third gospel in the New Testament. About 3/4 of the way through your Bibles, if you have one, you will find the Gospel of Luke. As I said earlier this year, Luke was really the first investigative reporter. He went and talked to all the eyewitnesses. He went and talked to all the people he could find about Jesus and said, tell me who Jesus really is. Tell me who Jesus really wanted us to be. Tell me what he actually did. And he investigated and he wrote down all of the facts. So the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is written in such a way that it is meant to be an eyewitness account of Jesus' life. And in the 8th chapter of Luke's Gospel, he tells a story about Jesus that I think shapes the way we should look at how we view the world around us. And this is the way it begins. This is now, when Jesus returned, and he'd been out teaching and doing lots of different things, and he comes back in, and he thought he was in isolation, but when he comes back in town, there's this crowd waiting for him because people had heard about the healings, they'd heard about all the great stuff that he's doing, and so when Jesus comes to town, it was a parade, okay? So Jesus comes into town thinking it's going to be a small thing, massive crowds of people. He returns, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then, a man named Jairus, that's you, a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. So, he'd heard all the stories about Jesus being this great healer, and he'd heard all the stories about Jesus being able to overcome all of these oddities and all of these things that were happening in the world. And it's okay, Jesus has come to my town. This isn't an accident. I want to find him. I want to ask him for his help. And so he comes and he asks Jesus, he says, look, you've got to come to my house. My only daughter is very sick. So, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. So he's trying to maneuver through town, and there's, lots and lots of people. Hundreds of people have just come out of their homes in these narrow streets. And Jairus is leading the way to his home for Jesus to come along with some of his disciples, but they just can't get there. Have you ever, it's like trying to exit Bryant-Denny Stadium. I have done that, okay? And everybody wants to go a different direction, but all of a sudden they see you're coming and you're kind of famous, and they all just kind of crowd in. Maybe you've never experienced the famous thing, but hey, listen, it happens. They all crowd in and press in, and you can't move. You don't know where to go. You're shoulder to shoulder with people. And so Jairus is feeling urgent, okay? You're feeling like, listen, when I left, she was not feeling well. I've got to get you there. And so all these people are pressing in on him, and he wants to get to Jairus' home, but there's just too many people in the way. Now, what do you feel? You probably feel that feeling of what you do when you're in traffic, right? And you're already 5 minutes late because you didn't plan well. Let's just be honest. You're not late because of traffic. You're not late because something went wrong. You're just late because you didn't plan well. I'll make an I statement. I am late because I don't plan well sometimes. But you feel that like, everybody's got to get out of my way right now, right? And this light, why is this light so long? It's never this long. And how does I got caught at all of them? And you just notice all of this stuff. And you feel pressed. And your brain starts to do what? Panic. And in this panic, in this fog, you're like, I know what needs to happen. I just, all the morals, all the character, all the other stuff is out the window. I just want to get to where I need to go. Now, it doesn't record what Jairus says in the middle of this, so we kind of got to interpret. But if you're thinking that way, that's probably where he's at, because he has a sense of urgency that the doctor, the healer, would get to this significant problem in his life. The story goes on. And a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but not one of them could heal her. So in other words, the crowd is pressing in on Jesus, and somewhere in the midst of that crowd is someone else who wants the healer to help her. And again, not given a ton of context other than the fact that she had been subject to this bleeding issue for 12 years, and that she was struggling with it, and no one could help her. There's actually a different translation, an extra manuscript, that talks about the fact that she had spent all of her money on every doctor that she could find to try to get help, and no one could help her. So she feels a sense of urgency too. And so Jesus, great healer, great physician, is standing in the middle of this crowd. Jairus is anxious. He's got this problem he wants Jesus to solve. The crowd just wants to see Jesus, but in the middle of that is another woman who feels just as anxious about her situation. And so they're moving through the crowd. The story continues like this. She came up behind him, Jesus, and she touched the edge of his cloak. He doesn't say this, and so there's a little bit of a creative liberty that I take with this, but I've always imagined that this crowd, they're pressing in on him and it's shoulder to shoulder, and so the only way for her to get to Jesus this sleekly, like this carefully, is just she crawled. And so again, the story doesn't say that, so if that bothers you, please forgive me, but in my brain, I've always pictured her having to crawl underneath the feet, and then to reach out. She's just like, with all of her might, she knows that Jesus could do something, right, but she just reaches out with all of her might to just try to touch his cloak. Having been in a place before where I've been desperate for God, I can relate to what she feels. Just as a sidebar, that like, God, I know you can solve this, and if I could just like one touch, God, if I could just have like one touch, if you could just like be here just for this moment, just for a second. And so she finds herself reaching up to touch the edge of his cloak, and it says immediately her bleeding stopped. So this problem that she'd had for 12 years immediately stopped. Now that's all well and good, and we think it's awesome, right? They call this story the miracle on the way to a miracle, right? That it's just kind of happened in the crowd. And that would be fine, right? If they just kept moving and the story went on, we would have this recorded moment. It'd be super cool. But listen to what happens next. And again, you're Jairus, so don't forget who you are in this story. Who touched me? Jesus asked. And he's like, stops. Like, whoa. Somebody touched me. Who touched me? Now, when everybody denied it, Peter being Peter, because he's this bold, brash, emotional dude, he's like, Master, they're crowding around and pressing against you. In other words, everybody touched you, right? Everybody's touching you. Jesus, this is the silliest question you've ever asked. Like, there's tons and hundreds of people here. Everyone's pressing against you. Everybody's touching you. Can we just move on? But Jesus won't let it go. And in fact, he stops the parade. And he makes everybody pause. Even though Jairus is feeling super urgent, and even though Jairus is feeling really uncomfortable about this situation, and he's feeling more and more anxious by the minute, the red light stops, right? The traffic stops. The parade stops. And Jesus won't let it go. He said, but Jesus said, someone touched me, and I know that power has gone out from me. I know that power has gone out from me. Something happened in this moment, and it was significant, and I do not want to miss this, and I don't want anybody else to miss this. What happened? Who touched me? Now, let me back up for just a minute. Jesus is God in a body, so he already knows the answer to this question. All right? Now, Jairus doesn't know that, and the crowd doesn't know that, and the disciples don't know that, but he already knows the answer to this question. So, Jairus, just put yourself in his shoes for a minute. What are you thinking now? What are you thinking now? Jesus, what are you doing? What are you doing? We got a place to go. this is great, move on, everyone's touching you. The same thing Peter's thinking, right? Peter's feeling that urgency, he's getting caught up in the crowd, he's getting caught up in the emotion. He's like, Lord, we gotta go, we got stuff we've got to do. And Jesus said, no, something happened in this moment, I don't want to miss this. And so finally, it says, then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, right? She was trying to go unnoticed. She was trying to not be seen, which is all the more reason for me to think that she crawled like underneath people's feet, carefully, methodically, stealthily, trying not to be seen. Seeing that she could not go unnoticed, she came trembling because she was afraid of what Jesus would say. She came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. So, Jesus, you're right. It was me. I did this. This is why. This is what I was feeling. And again, all the while, Jesus is making a moment out of this, and Jairus is feeling more and more and more uncomfortable. But listen, justifiably so, right? You're Jairus. You feel this. This is your baby girl. There's stuff going on. God, your timing. What the heck with your timing, God? This ain't that. There's things to do. You need to be here now. You need to be doing what I need you to do now. Then he said, and he's again not talking to Jairus, back to the woman, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Now, I don't have time to unpack this for you because this isn't really the point of the story. We're going to get back to you, your character, in just a minute. But don't miss this. That in the simplest way, without even a word of repentance or without a word of any kind of beg or ask, just by coming into the presence of Jesus because she knew he could do something, changed her life forever. Now, back to you. So, while Jesus was speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and says, your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Now, at this point, Jairus, as a dad, it doesn't say this, but I just infer he just loses it. All right? This will be the moment where I'm like jumping up and going, Jesus, come on, man. Like you were supposed to go with me. And maybe he's not necessarily blaming Jesus. Maybe he's blaming the crowds. Maybe he's blaming the moment, but he's blaming somebody. And he's frustrated, and he's angry, and he's hurt, and he's sad, and he's upset. And if that was the ending of the story, right? If that was the ending of the story, then wow, we would have a lot of questions for Jesus. It's not the ending of the story. But before I read you the end of the story, I want to point out something really, really important. Jesus was fiercely present. Jesus was fiercely present. And when people came to him, timing or not, Jesus did these crazy things where, there's this story where Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And he comes into this town that's just outside of Jerusalem. It's kind of the last stop. And the parade is there, and all the famous people are there, and Jesus is supposed to be going on to the cross. He's supposed to be going on to Jerusalem. That's what he set his mind to do. The whole shift of his mind is gone. I'm going to Jerusalem. But he comes into town, and there's this little guy named Zacchaeus who desperately wanted to see Jesus, but he couldn't because of the crowd. So he climbs a tree. Jesus changes his entire itinerary at that moment and goes directly to Zacchaeus and said, listen, I know I'm going on to Jerusalem, but tonight I'm dining at your house. Fiercely present. There's another story where Jesus is teaching on a hillside, and there's thousands of people that have come to hear and be present and to listen to his teaching, and it starts to get dark. And Jesus looks at his disciples and said, hey, it's getting dark, it's supper time, why don't you feed these people? And Peter looks at him like 3 lunch boxes between him, and like, this isn't happening, Jesus, there's no way this could happen. And Jesus said, you give them something to eat. Fiercely present. See, Jesus understood that in his time, in this place where he was, and in the macro of the way we look at life, being present mattered. But what we get wrong is when he doesn't show up exactly the way we think he should. Exactly when we think he should. Exactly how we think he should. See, the story ends like this. I want to read it to you. Jairus is standing there in his own puddle of tears, which is what I would be, and he's upset and he's sad. And, Jairus has been kind of pulled to the side, right? Jesus is making eye contact with this woman. And Jesus overhears the servant come and say, listen, don't bother him anymore. There's no point. And this is what it says in verse 50. Hearing this, like overhearing this, he turns to Jairus and he says, don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed. And when he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Stop wailing, Jesus said. She's not dead, but asleep. And everyone laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, my child, get up. Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them, go and give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. Jesus already had in mind the way that this was going to work, the way this story was going to end, the healing that he was going to bring. But he knew that in this moment of all the chaos that everyone else was pressing in on him and all the chaos that people were trying to throw his way, he knew the right thing to do. Because Jesus was fiercely present. And if I could step on your toes for just a minute, as someone who loves you, and only people who love you say hard things. Jesus was fiercely present, but we're not. We're not. Even Jesus followers, we're not. I'm going to be completely honest and vulnerable with you and tell you a story I don't really want to tell, but it's true. I don't know how many of you all have ever spent a considerable amount of time with a ministry family or around ministry families. But one of the realities that we live in is sometimes life is hard. Sometimes this job is not easy. It's just difficult. And I found myself about 3 weeks ago in a place where I just wanted to go home and I just wanted to space out of my phone for a second. And so I'm sitting in the chair in our living room and I'm just like literally scrolling social media just to scroll. And I didn't hear my 7-year-old saying daddy. And she said daddy like 5 times. I didn't hear her. I was like spaced out completely. And she finally comes up and she gets in my lap. I'm still scrolling my phone. And she grabs my face like this. And she presses me up and says, look at me. And it's funny, but it's not. Because I want to be present for my kids, for my family, for my wife, for the people that are around me. But sometimes I find myself wanting to escape. And it's easy, okay? And it's an honest reaction. I find myself wanting to step out of the reality that I find myself in. But what if there was a different answer? What if escaping wasn't the right thing, but processing where I am differently? This isn't a Christian thing, this is just a thing. But it says, psychologists say that we as a country are in what they're calling an attention crisis. There's lots of different reasons that they think this is the case, lots of different excuses for why this has happened, but we find ourselves in a place where none of us can focus. In fact, for Americans, just so you know, there's been a study that was done recently, and they said the average American has 3 things that you can say are true of almost every American. Number 1, throughout their day, they spend a whole lot of time not paying attention. Number 2, they spend a whole lot of time not thinking critically. And number 3, they spend a lot of time not being intentional. Now, don't raise a hand. Don't elbow your spouse. But this isn't a Christian thing. This is just a thing. We find ourselves in a place where we're not really present. We're not really wanting to deal with where we are. Again, I'm not saying we didn't get here honest, okay? Next week, we're going to talk a lot about how we got here and what we can do to get out of it. I just want to embrace the reality that we are here. I just want you to see that this is where we are. And just for the record, I want to tell you really quick before we close what's at stake. Listen to this. Again, not a Christian thing. This is just a thing. This same study showed that in our country, post-2020, post-pandemic, we have reduced communication in our relationships. We have increased conflict in our relationships. We have depersonalization, which means like we have drowned out reality so much that we've stopped understanding our spouses, our kids, our friends as people and more as like objects that are just a part of how we deal with our reality. We have a failure to listen and then decreased intimacy. For those of you that might be struggling in your marriage right now, this could be one of the realities that's just because of the way we look at the world right now, because we're not present. Now, for parents, I want to throw one more layer to this to you, just so you know. And everything I'm about to say is found in a book. Sorry, I threw it on the floor. It's found in a book called Seen. And the authors of this book are actually a part of the kids' curriculum that we have that we use every Sunday morning. We're actually lobbying to have them come in the spring to be here. But everything I'm about to say comes from this book, okay? And I would encourage you, if you're a parent, to go grab this and check it out. It's called Seeing Healing Despair and Anxiety in Kids and Teens Through the Power of Connection. But here's what they say is at stake for our kids. Low self-esteem. They said that the low self-esteem that a lot of our kids and our students are feeling right now is because people aren't present in their lives. Whether it's their parents, their friends, their teachers, we're not here in the moment. We're not dealing with reality. We're just pretending that it's not here. Behavioral issues, emotional neglect, and then these two, which are huge, depression and self-harm. Do you know that throughout the pandemic, I've shared this statistic before, but I don't want you to miss this because this is important. Through the pandemic, the number of students aged 13 to 19 who contemplated suicide went up 3,000%. 3,000%. This is the world in which we live right now. If I might say what I think the point is, and what Jesus has to say, is that presence influences healing more than anything else. Being present influences healing more than anything else. The question, and this is just where we're going to stop, the question that I have for you, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? At the end of the day, right, when you're thinking about, how you look back on this moment, do you want to tell the story where you find yourself in a place where reality was difficult, but rather than living in it and processing it and helping the people around you process it, you just escaped? Or do you want to tell the story that this is that moment in history where all of us were struggling as a society, as individuals, as corporately, as the church, as Americans, we were all struggling, but in this moment we decided to be present, to be here now, and to allow God to shape the way that we look at the world. That's the question to wrestle with. Sherry, if you would back up to that last scripture for me for just a second. I said the phrase and she thought that's what I meant. But I want to read something to you from Ephesians and then we're going to quit. I want you to think about these words because Paul wrote these words to the Ephesians. The letter to the Ephesians was written to a group of people who not necessarily had one big struggle, but he just said, if you want to learn how to live as Jesus followers, these are some of the things you need to know. Like it was a very practical book. You should check it out if you're trying to figure out how to live the life. But one of the most powerful things he says in the 5th chapter is he says, you're going to be tempted to not pay attention to what's happening. But listen, he says this, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Not in spite of the fact that the days are evil, not in spite of the circumstances you might find yourself, but because of those circumstances, be here now. See, I think as a pastor, the thing that's at stake in this moment for the church is our influence. If the people outside of the church look in at people who are people of faith, people of hope, people of courage, and they see us not able to process what we're going through, not able to lean on our Savior, not able to lean on our God in these difficult circumstantial moments, then why do they want what we have? Now, for those of you that aren't Jesus followers, that doesn't really apply to you, but you have a question to ask yourselves. What's at stake in my life, and what story do I want to tell? And we will pick it up right there next week in part 2 of Be Here Now. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I want to thank you so much for this time we have together today.